He invited his ex-wife to his wedding to humiliate her, expecting tears, regret, maybe even desperation. But when Claire Bennett stepped out of a yellow cab in a simple ivory dress, alone, something felt off. The whispers started, the smirks spread, and Ryan tightened his grip on his bride's hand, ready to enjoy the show. "You actually came," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Claire just smiled, calm, unreadable. Then a staff member rushed forward, lowering his voice with sudden respect. "Ms. Bennett, they're ready for you." Ryan's smile faltered, because suddenly, the night didn't belong to him anymore. He wanted her to watch him replace her. The late afternoon sun spilled across the white stone steps of the vineyard estate, catching on polished glass and gold-trimmed chairs arranged in perfect symmetry, everything curated to reflect Ryan Caldwell's version of a flawless life. And for a moment the air hummed with anticipation, with quiet judgment, with the soft rustle of silk and tailored suits as guests turned toward the entrance where a yellow cab pulled up, out of place, almost laughable against the line of black luxury cars. And when the door opened, Claire Bennett stepped out alone, her dress simple, ivory, unadorned, the fabric moving gently in the breeze as if it belonged somewhere quieter, somewhere far from this performance. And the murmurs began instantly, subtle at first, then spreading like ripples through the crowd, because this wasn't how they expected her to return, not after everything, not after the way she had disappeared without explanation, without defense, without even trying to reclaim the life that had been taken from her. And yet here she was, walking forward with measured steps, her posture steady, her expression calm in a way that felt almost deliberate, almost rehearsed, as if she had already seen this moment play out 100 times and had chosen exactly how she would stand in it. And across the terrace Ryan noticed her, his smile sharpening just slightly as he leaned closer to Sophie Lane, his bride-to-be glowing in layers of lace and diamonds, whispering something that made her laugh softly, a sound that carried just enough to invite attention, to signal that the show was beginning exactly as planned. And when Claire reached the edge of the ceremony space, a few guests shifted to make room, though not without glances, without curiosity, without that quiet sense of superiority that comes from watching someone you believe has already lost. And Ryan finally stepped forward, his voice smooth, controlled, projecting just enough warmth to disguise the edge beneath it. "Claire, you came." And it was not a question but a performance, a line delivered for an audience he had carefully assembled, and a few nearby guests leaned in, waiting, expecting hesitation, expecting discomfort, expecting her to shrink under the weight of it. But Claire only looked at him for a second longer than necessary, her eyes steady, her lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite indifference. And she said nothing, not a single word, just a small nod that landed heavier than any response could have. And for a flicker of a second something in Ryan's expression faltered, almost imperceptible, because this was not the reaction he had prepared for, not the version of her he remembered, the one who used to explain, to apologize, to fill the silence he created. And Sophie stepped closer, her gaze sliding over Claire with polished ease, her voice light, almost sweet. "It's a beautiful day, isn't it?" And Claire turned her head slightly, acknowledging her presence without engaging, without offering anything that could be used against her. And the space between them held, thin and charged, until suddenly a member of the event staff appeared at Claire's side, his posture shifting the moment he recognized her, his tone dropping into something quieter, more careful. "Ms. Bennett, everything is ready when you are." And the words seemed to dissolve into the air before anyone fully processed them, except Ryan, whose smile didn't disappear but tightened, just enough to betray the first crack in the story he thought he was controlling. Because somewhere beneath the surface of this perfect wedding, something had already begun to shift, and Claire Bennett had not come to watch. She had come for something else entirely. The music swelled softly across the vineyard, a string quartet playing something light and expensive, the kind of melody meant to make everything feel effortless. But Ryan could not quite shake the subtle shift that had settled into the air, like a temperature drop no one wanted to acknowledge, and he laughed it off, guiding Sophie back toward the center aisle where guests were beginning to take their seats, because this was his moment, his carefully constructed victory, and nothing was supposed to interrupt it. Yet as he glanced over his shoulder, he noticed something that did not fit, small at first, almost dismissible. The way a few staff members straightened when Claire moved. The way one of the event coordinators stepped aside not out of obligation but out of deference. And he frowned slightly before smoothing it over, telling himself it meant nothing, that it was just coincidence, just nerves. But Sophie leaned closer, her voice low and controlled. Why are they treating her like that? And Ryan forced a smile, brushing it off with a quiet confidence he no longer fully felt. It does not matter, he said, though his eyes lingered a moment too long, tracking Claire as she moved through the space with an ease that did not match the story he had told himself about her. Because she was not shrinking, she was not avoiding anyone, she was not even pretending to belong, she simply did. And that was the problem, because this was supposed to be the place where she felt smallest, where every polished surface reflected what she had lost, where every whispered conversation reminded her of the life she could not keep. And yet Claire walked as if none of that had power over her anymore, as if the past had already released its hold. And across the terrace a few familiar faces approached her cautiously, offering polite greetings that carried a hint of curiosity, a hint of disbelief. And Claire responded with the same measured calm, never oversharing, never apologizing, never explaining. And it unsettled them, because they had expected something else, something easier to categorize, easier to dismiss. And Ryan felt it then, that subtle erosion of control, the way attention shifted not loudly but undeniably, like a current pulling focus away from where it was supposed to be. And he stepped forward again, determined to reclaim it, his voice raised just enough to gather a small circle of listeners. I hope you found the place all right, he said, the words polite but edged. It is not exactly easy to get here without the right connections. And there it was, the quiet jab, the reminder of status, of access, of everything he believed she no longer had. And a few guests exchanged knowing looks, waiting for her to react, to falter, to reveal the weakness they had already assigned to her. But Claire only tilted her head slightly, as if considering the statement rather than absorbing it. And then she gave the smallest smile, calm and unbothered, a response so controlled it did not give him anything to push against. And before Ryan could say more, before he could steer the moment back into something he understood, the same staff member returned, this time with another figure behind him. Someone older, sharply dressed, carrying the quiet authority of a person used to being listened to. And he stopped beside Claire with a respectful nod. We are ready whenever you are, Miss Bennett, he said clearly, not loud but impossible to ignore. And the words landed differently this time. No longer a passing detail, but something that rippled outward, catching the attention of more than just a few nearby guests. And Ryan felt it, that unmistakable shift, the ground beneath his carefully built moment beginning to tilt, because whatever he thought this night was going to be, it was no longer following his script, and Claire Bennett stood at the center of it, not as a guest, not as an afterthought, but as something far more deliberate, something he had never once considered. The pause stretched just a second too long, just enough for every shifting glance, every quiet whisper, to sharpen into focus, and Ryan felt it like pressure building behind his ribs as the man beside Claire adjusted his cufflinks with an ease that spoke of authority rather than service. And the distinction became impossible to ignore, because staff did not wait like that, they did not defer like that. And yet here he was, standing half a step behind her, as if awaiting permission, and Claire did not rush, she did not fill the silence, she simply let it exist, her gaze drifting briefly across the ceremony space, across the rows of carefully arranged chairs, the arch of white roses, the subtle gold accents that had been chosen to impress, to signal taste, to signal power. And for the first time Ryan saw it through a different lens, not as his stage, but as something being evaluated, measured. And he stepped forward again, a little too quickly this time, his voice tightening at the edges despite his effort to keep it smooth. What exactly is going on here? And it was no longer a performance, no longer a line delivered for effect. It was a question he had not planned to ask, and Claire turned back to him, meeting his eyes fully now. And there was no hesitation there, no trace of the woman he remembered trying to read him, trying to anticipate him, trying to earn space in a life he controlled, because that version of her did not exist in this moment. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, even, carrying just enough to reach the nearest guests without rising into spectacle. Venue, she said, as if clarifying something simple, something obvious, needed final approval before the ceremony could begin, and a flicker of confusion crossed his face before he could stop it, because that was not how this worked. That was not his role to question, and yet the man beside her inclined his head slightly, confirming it without words, and a few guests exchanged looks, their curiosity shifting into something more attentive, more cautious, as if the ground beneath the event had subtly shifted and they were only just realizing it. And Sophie's hand tightened around Ryan's arm, her composure still intact, but no longer effortless. "Ryan," she murmured under her breath. "What does she mean?" And he did not answer, because he did not know. And that was the problem. The unfamiliar, unwelcome realization that something had been moving beyond his control long before he noticed it. And Claire took a small step forward, not toward him, but toward the center of the space, where the aisle began, her presence drawing the room's attention without demanding it, and the man with her spoke again, this time with quiet clarity. "Ms. Bennett is the principal investor behind the estate's recent acquisition," and the words landed cleanly, without emphasis, without drama, which somehow made them heavier, more final, and the effect was immediate, not loud but undeniable. A ripple of recognition moving through the guests as pieces began to align, as assumptions quietly unraveled. And Ryan felt his certainty fracture, not dramatically but in small, precise breaks, because this was not part of the narrative he had built, not part of the version of her he had relied on. And Claire stood there in the same simple dress, the same understated presence, and yet everything around her had shifted, the way people looked at her, the way the space seemed to orient itself around her. And she did not smile. She did not claim the moment. She simply existed within it, composed, grounded, and entirely in control. And in that silence, in that subtle but irreversible shift, it became clear that this was no longer his perfect day unfolding as planned. It was something else entirely, something he had never anticipated, and for the first time since he sent that invitation, Ryan Caldwell realized he had misunderstood exactly who he had invited back into his world. The silence did not break. It deepened, settling over the vineyard like a weight no one had prepared for, and Ryan felt every pair of eyes shifting, not away from Claire but toward her, recalibrating, reassessing, as if the entire room had just realized they had been looking at the wrong person all along. And the carefully curated balance of power he had built into this moment began to tilt in ways he could not correct, not with charm, not with status, not with the narrative he had relied on for so long, because none of it seemed to apply anymore. And Sophie's grip on his arm tightened just slightly, her polished composure now edged with something sharper, something uncertain. "Ryan," she said again, softer this time, but no less urgent, "fix this." And that word lingered, because for the first time he did not know how, and Claire did not rush to fill the space. She did not claim attention or explain herself further. She simply stood there, allowing the truth to settle on its own terms, and it was that restraint, that refusal to perform, that made the shift undeniable, because she was not here to prove anything. She was here because she already had, and one of the older guests, a man Ryan had spent months trying to impress, stepped forward with a measured smile, his tone respectful in a way it had never been before. "Ms. Bennett, I had no idea you were involved in the acquisition." And Claire inclined her head slightly, acknowledging him without overplaying the moment. "It was a recent decision," she said, her voice calm. "I prefer to keep things quiet until they are complete." And the choice of words landed with quiet precision, because Ryan understood exactly what she meant, understood that everything he had assumed about her absence, her silence, her so-called disappearance, had never been weakness. It had been distance, intentional and controlled, and the realization settled into his chest with an uncomfortable clarity, because the version of her he had invited tonight no longer existed, and perhaps it had not existed for a long time. And the event coordinator approached again, this time addressing Claire directly in a tone that left no room for misinterpretation. "We are ready to proceed once you confirm." And Claire glanced briefly at the ceremony space, at the arch, at the seating, at the details Ryan had obsessed over. And for a moment it almost felt as though the entire event was paused, suspended on her decision rather than his. And she gave a small nod, simple, controlled, and the coordinator immediately turned to signal the musicians, to adjust the flow of the ceremony, to set everything back into motion, but not in the way Ryan had planned, not entirely under his direction. And that was the final shift, subtle yet absolute, because the day had not been taken from him. It had been reframed, rebalanced in a way that placed Claire not at the edge of the story, but at its center. And as the music began again, softer at first, Ryan stood there for a fraction too long, his confidence no longer seamless, his certainty no longer intact, watching as Claire stepped aside with quiet grace, not seeking the spotlight, not needing it. And in that moment, he understood something he had never considered before. That power did not always arrive loudly. It did not always announce itself with grand gestures or visible symbols. Sometimes it walked in quietly, in a simple dress, alone, and by the time you noticed it, it had already changed everything. The ceremony resumed, but it no longer felt like a performance Ryan controlled. It felt like something he was trying to catch up to, something already moving ahead of him. And as the guests settled into their seats again, there was a different kind of attention in the air, quieter but sharper, no longer centered entirely on him and Sophie, but drifting, returning, almost involuntarily, to where Claire now stood near the edge of the aisle, composed and still, as if she had always belonged exactly there, and Ryan forced himself forward, guiding Sophie into position, his smile returning, but thinner now, stretched over something he could not quite contain, and the officiant began to speak, his voice steady, practiced, filling the space with familiar words about commitment and beginnings. But even those words seemed to land differently, because Ryan could feel it, the subtle fracture in the narrative, the awareness that this moment was no longer untouched, no longer unquestioned. And as he glanced out at the crowd, he noticed it in the small things, the way a few guests leaned toward one another in quiet conversation, the way others looked between him and Claire, as if recalculating something they had once taken for granted. And Sophie sensed it too, her posture still perfect, but her smile no longer effortless, her attention flickering just slightly as she followed the direction of those glances. And Ryan tightened his jaw, focusing on the script, on the sequence, on the certainty he had built this day around, because he needed it to hold. He needed something to remain exactly as planned. And then, just as the officiant paused to transition into the vows, a soft interruption came from the side, not loud, not disruptive, but precise enough to draw attention, and the coordinator stepped forward again, addressing Claire with the same quiet respect. "Ms. Bennett, there is one final detail that requires your approval before we proceed." And the timing of it, the calm certainty of it, shifted the room once more, because it made clear what had only been implied before, that this event, this entire setting, was still subject to her authority. And Claire did not react with surprise. She did not apologize for the interruption. She simply stepped forward a fraction, her gaze moving briefly across the arrangement, the layout, the details that had been so carefully designed. And Ryan felt a flicker of frustration, sharp and unfamiliar, because this was supposed to be the moment where everything focused on him, where nothing else intruded. And yet here it was, slipping, redirecting, and he spoke before he could stop himself, his voice lower now, edged with something he could not fully disguise. "This is my wedding," he said, as if stating it would restore control, and Claire turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze again, and there was no challenge in her expression, no need to confront him directly, just a quiet clarity that settled between them, and she answered in the same, even tone. "And it is my venue." And the simplicity of it, the absence of any need to elaborate, landed harder than anything louder could have, because it reframed everything in a single moment, and the guests felt it, that shift from assumption to understanding, that quiet recognition of where the true center of control now rested. And Claire gave a small nod to the coordinator, confirming whatever needed confirming, and the process moved forward again, but not as it had before, not with the same unchallenged momentum, because something fundamental had changed. And Ryan stood there, the weight of it settling in, realizing that this was no longer a stage he had built to display his success. It was a space he was now sharing with someone who no longer fit the role he had assigned her, someone who had stepped back into his world not to be seen, not to be judged, but to quietly, unmistakably redefine it. The vows continued, but their meaning no longer landed the way they were meant to. Each carefully chosen word echoing into a space that had already shifted beyond its original intent. And Ryan spoke when it was his turn, his voice steady enough to pass, but not untouched, not entirely free of the awareness pressing in from every direction, because he could feel it now, the difference between control and performance, between owning a moment and merely standing inside one that no longer belonged to him. And as he spoke about promises and future and permanence, his eyes flickered once, just once, toward the edge of the aisle where Claire stood, still composed, still quiet, her presence unchanged and yet impossible to ignore. And for a brief second something unfamiliar passed through him, not regret, not fully, but something close enough to unsettle, because the contrast was undeniable, between the life he had built in visible layers of success and the quiet, unspoken strength that now stood just outside of it. And Sophie began her vows next, her voice clear, confident, but there was a slight tension beneath it now, a carefulness that had not been there before, as if she too had realized that this moment was no longer entirely theirs. And the guests listened, but not with the same unquestioning attention, because part of them remained elsewhere, drawn again and again toward Claire, toward the unanswered questions she carried simply by standing there. And when the officiant finally pronounced them married, the applause came, polite and warm, but it did not rise into the kind of overwhelming celebration Ryan had imagined. It settled instead, measured, contained, as if the room itself was still recalibrating. And as the couple turned to walk back down the aisle, Ryan felt it most clearly, the subtle shift in how people looked at him, not with admiration alone, but with something more complex, something less certain. And as he passed Claire, just a few feet away, their eyes met again, and this time he hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, long enough for the moment to register, long enough for him to realize that whatever distance he had once placed between them no longer existed in the same way, because she was no longer behind him, no longer beneath the version of himself he had constructed. She stood parallel to him now, in a position he had never accounted for, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not approval, not acknowledgement of his moment, but something quieter, something that felt like closure without explanation. And Ryan continued walking, but the feeling lingered, the awareness that something had ended and something else had quietly begun without his permission. And as the reception began to unfold, with champagne glasses raised and soft laughter returning to the air, the conversations shifted in tone, subtle but unmistakable, because now when people spoke about the venue, about the event, about the day, her name entered those conversations with a weight that could not be ignored. And Ryan heard it, in passing remarks, in quiet admiration, in the way certain guests sought her out rather than him. And each instance, small on its own, accumulated into something larger, something that eroded the narrative he had tried to control from the beginning. And across the terrace Claire remained exactly as she had been, calm, measured, untouched by the need to assert or explain, speaking when spoken to, listening more than she spoke. And in that restraint there was a kind of authority that did not demand attention but held it effortlessly. And Ryan realized then, standing in the middle of what was supposed to be his defining moment, that the power he had relied on had always required recognition, had always depended on being seen in a certain way, but hers did not. Hers existed whether he acknowledged it or not, whether anyone applauded it or not. And that was the difference he could not ignore, the difference that changed everything. Because she had not returned to reclaim the past, she had returned as something entirely separate from it, something he no longer had any claim over. And as the evening light began to soften over the vineyard, casting long shadows across the polished space, Ryan understood, with a clarity that left no room for denial, that the invitation he had sent had not brought back the woman he thought he knew. It had revealed the one he had never truly seen. The reception unfolded in layers of polished elegance, crystal glasses catching the last light of evening, soft jazz drifting through the vineyard as servers moved with quiet precision. But beneath the surface of it all, something had shifted in a way that could not be reversed, and Ryan felt it in every interaction, in the way conversations paused just slightly when he approached, in the way attention no longer settled on him with the same certainty, because now there was another center in that room, one that did not try to claim it, one that did not need to. And Claire stood near the edge of the terrace, a glass of sparkling water in her hand, listening more than speaking, her posture relaxed, her presence effortless in a way that drew people toward her without invitation. And one by one, guests began to cross that invisible distance, some out of curiosity, some out of recognition, others because something about her composure suggested there was more beneath the surface than they had ever considered. And Ryan watched it happen in fragments, each moment small on its own, but impossible to ignore when taken together, a quiet accumulation of attention shifting away from him and settling elsewhere. And Sophie noticed it too, her smile still in place but no longer untouched by tension, her eyes following the subtle movement of the room as it reoriented itself. "They are talking to her," she said under her breath. Not quite a question, not quite a complaint, and Ryan exhaled. Slowly, trying to dismiss it, trying to return to the version of the evening he had imagined. But it slipped through his grasp again, because this was no longer about a single moment. It was about a presence that could not be reduced or dismissed. And across the terrace, an older woman in a tailored navy dress approached Claire with a polite nod, introducing herself as someone from the acquisition board, her tone respectful, almost deferential. And Claire responded with the same quiet ease she had carried all evening, never overplaying, never diminishing, simply existing in a space that now recognized her differently. And Ryan felt something unfamiliar settle deeper this time. Not anger, not even frustration, but a kind of dissonance, because the narrative he had built, the one where he stood at the center of success, and she existed somewhere behind it, no longer held together under the weight of what he was seeing. And he moved toward her before he could reconsider, drawn by something he could not fully name, stopping just within reach, just close enough for their presence to overlap without forcing interaction. And for a moment he did not speak, because the words he might have used before no longer seemed to fit. And Claire turned slightly, acknowledging him without surprise, without tension, as if this moment had always been inevitable. And he finally said, quieter than he intended, "You planned this." Not an accusation, not entirely, but a realization spoken aloud. And Claire's expression did not change, her gaze steady, her voice even. "No," she said. "I prepared for it." And the distinction landed with quiet clarity, because it reframed everything. Not as a calculated return, not as a performance designed to reclaim attention, but as something far more controlled, far more intentional. A life built beyond the reach of his expectations. And Ryan stood there for a second longer, absorbing it, understanding that whatever he had thought this evening would prove, it had instead revealed something else entirely, something he had not accounted for. And as Claire turned back toward the conversation waiting for her, stepping effortlessly back into the flow of the room, Ryan remained where he was, no longer at the center, no longer certain of his position within it, realizing that the shift he felt was not temporary, not something he could correct or outmaneuver. It was the quiet, irreversible outcome of a truth he had overlooked for far too long.